They say some buildings remember what people forget. But no one, not the townspeople, not the police, not even the historians, could explain why a K-9 unit refused to leave the west wall of an old courthouse. Until they broke through the bricks and found what had been sealed away for nearly 40 years. This is the story of Diesel, the dog who uncovered what a town tried to bury. What began as a routine patrol became a chilling discovery that would shake everything to the core. They say justice is blind. But that day, it had ears and 4 legs. The courthouse in Willow Creek had stood for over 100 years. Red brick, white columns, and a cracked bell that hadn't rung since 1987. It was the kind of building people passed every day but rarely entered, unless they had to. Court dates, clerk paperwork, or local elections. But on this particular Tuesday morning, it wasn't the law drawing attention. It was a dog. Officer Mason Briggs wasn't supposed to be there. His unit had been called to assist with a traffic stop on the other side of town. But something about the courthouse, about him, had brought them here. Mason's partner, Diesel, a black Belgian Malinois with a silver streak behind his left ear, had been restless all morning, growling low in the back of the squad car, eyes fixed on the courthouse steps every time they passed by. "You need to work off that energy, pal," Mason muttered, pulling the cruiser into the empty lot beside the building. The plan was simple, a quick perimeter walk. Nothing serious. Let Diesel sniff around, stretch his legs, calm down. They didn't even make it to the front steps. The moment his paws hit the ground, Diesel bolted, dragging Mason toward the building like something was pulling him. His nose was to the concrete. Body low, muscles tense, not in attack mode, in alert. "Diesel," Mason barked, yanking back on the leash. "Easy, we're not chasing perps today." But Diesel didn't care. He started pawing at the west-facing wall of the building. Not the door, not a window, a solid brick wall that hadn't been touched in decades. Mason crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" That's when Diesel growled, a low, guttural rumble that Mason had only heard twice before, once during a drug bust, the other during a missing persons case that ended in tragedy. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was a sound of warning. Then, he started barking, loud, repetitive, sharp, not to alert, to demand attention. Within minutes, people began to gather. The courthouse was mostly empty, just a clerk, a janitor, and the town historian, Mr. Harold Crane, who ran the tiny legal archive upstairs. But Mason could feel eyes on him from every window. "What's going on out here?" Harold called from the door, adjusting his glasses. "I don't know," Mason replied honestly. "But my K-9 thinks your wall's hiding something." Harold laughed nervously. "That building's older than both of us. Might be rats." Mason didn't laugh. Diesel wasn't barking at rats. Mason knew that bark. It was the same bark that led them to the shallow grave of a runaway girl last fall. He tightened Diesel's leash and stared at the brick wall. "What do you smell, buddy?" he whispered. Diesel whined, then scratched hard against one specific brick. Just one. Mason reached out and touched it. It was colder than the others. And when he tapped it, it echoed. Hollow. Mason stood there for a long moment, hand still pressed against the cold brick. He'd been a cop for 8 years. Long enough to know that instincts mattered, especially AK-9s. And Diesel wasn't just any K-9. He was certified in narcotics, explosives, and cadaver detection. When he barked like this, something was wrong. "I'm going to need access to the inside," Mason said, turning to Harold Crane, the elderly courthouse archivist who was now fidgeting nervously at the door. Harold hesitated. "The west wall? That's original structure. There's nothing behind it but foundation." "Maybe, but my dog disagrees. I'm sure it's just an old air pocket," Harold offered. "Buildings settle. Brick shifts. Dogs get confused." Mason's eyes narrowed. Diesel doesn't get confused. Inside, the courthouse was dim, lit mostly by narrow windows and outdated ceiling fans that creaked more than they spun. Mason followed Diesel through the empty hallways, his boots echoing off the marble tile. Diesel's body was taut, focused. He wasn't sniffing aimlessly. He moved with certainty, like a compass locked on north. They reached the west wing, a rarely used section lined with law books and yellowed portraits of retired judges. Diesel led him to a filing room that smelled of mothballs and dry wood. In the back corner, an old bookshelf stood flush against the wall. Diesel barked again, twice this time, then pawed at the base of the shelf. Okay, Mason muttered, pulling his flashlight from his belt. He knelt down and ran the light across the wall behind the shelf. Something caught his eye. A faint line in the paint. A square outline about the size of a crawlspace hatch. He tapped it, hollow again. Harold had followed them inside and now stood behind him, arms crossed. That's odd, Harold said. I've worked here 20 years and never noticed that. Mason stood and turned to him. Who built this wing? The courthouse was restored after a fire in 1984. There was smoke damage in the archives. They rebuilt most of the west wall from scratch. Who signed off on the work? Harold shifted uncomfortably. I'd have to dig out the permits. Do that. Mason stared at the faint outline again. It didn't feel like an air pocket. It felt like a door that had been forgotten or hidden. Diesel sat beside him now. Ears forward, tail still, waiting. Back outside, Mason radioed the station. Dispatch. This is Unit 5. I need a copy of the 1984 courthouse renovation records and the names of any contractors who worked the West Wing. A pause. Unit 5. That might take some digging. That's 40 years ago. I'll wait, he replied, then glanced back at Diesel. We're not leaving until we know what's behind that wall. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He sat in his living room. A stack of courthouse history books piled on the coffee table. Blueprints printed from the town archives spread across the floor. Diesel lay on the rug, eyes open, tracking every creak in the house. The blueprints confirmed what Mason feared. The wall Diesel barked at didn't appear in the 1983 plans. It only showed up in the 1985 update. Something had been added, a structure that hadn't existed before the fire. A wall built after the blaze. A wall that didn't belong. Mason returned to the courthouse just before dawn. No lights, no backup, no permission. Diesel trotted beside him, his paws silent on the damp courthouse steps. The town was still asleep. Fog curling through the streets like breath held too long. Mason hadn't even changed out of his hoodie and jeans. No badge, no uniform, just instinct. He picked the side door lock in under 20 seconds. Years in patrol had taught him more than just protocol. Inside, the building felt colder than it should have. Not just temperature-wise. Still, like it was holding its breath. They moved quietly through the West Wing until they reached the filing room again. The air here was different, denser. Somehow, Diesel froze in front of the bookshelf. Then sat and stared at it. Not barking now, just waiting. Okay, Mason muttered. Let's find out what they sealed up. He ran his hands along the wood frame. It wasn't fixed to the wall. That was his first clue. A slight wobble. A hidden bracket at the top. With a little effort, he pried it loose and slid the bookshelf aside. Behind it, barely visible under the yellow paint, was a wooden hatch door. About 4 feet wide, sealed with thick, rusted screws. No knob, no hinges showing. Someone hadn't just built this wall. They'd meant for it to stay shut. Mason crouched and placed his palm against the center of the panel. It felt warm. Not from sunlight. There wasn't any. From something else. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small crowbar. It took nearly 10 minutes to remove the screws. The wood creaked like it was exhaling for the first time in decades. Then he pulled the panel loose. The smell hit first, stale, metallic, and wrong. Behind the wall was a narrow corridor, no more than 3 feet wide, lined with rotting wood panels and flickering remnants of old wiring. The kind used in the 70s. Mason clicked on his flashlight. Diesel's ears perked forward. They stepped inside. It wasn't long, maybe 15 feet, but it felt endless. The deeper they walked, the more Mason felt the pressure build in his chest. Like something was pushing back. Like the air itself didn't want them here. At the end of the hallway was another door. Smaller. Steel. Bolted shut with a single padlock that had long since rusted through. Mason yanked it open with a hard pull. What he saw inside stopped him cold. The room was small, no more than 10 by 10 feet. But every inch of the walls was lined with paper. Faded, yellowing, brittle, court transcripts, witness statements, mugshots, all taped, stapled, or nailed to the wooden slats beneath. And in the center of the room, beneath a single, broken ceiling tile, stood a wooden chair. Chained to it was nothing. Not now, at least. But the chains were real. Rusted, tight. And on the floor below the chair, Mason saw it. A dark stain. Long dried into the wood. Blood. Diesel growled low behind him. Not barking, not moving forward, just watching. Mason scanned the documents on the wall. Names, cases, dates, all from 1984 and earlier. But one file was circled over and over in red ink. People vs. Charles Denton, a case he'd never heard of. The paper clipped beneath it was a booking photo. Black and white, a man with dead eyes and a crooked smile. Then Mason noticed the date. Trial never held. Disappeared. October 9, 1984, 1 week before the fire. Mason stood frozen in the center of the hidden room. Diesel by his side, the air thick with rot and silence. The walls stared back at him, hundreds of pages telling a story no one had wanted to hear. And at the center of it all, Charles Denton. Mason read the summary under the mugshot. It was faded, barely legible. Accused. Unlawful confinement. Child endangerment. Abuse of power. Status. Held in county jail awaiting trial. Notes. Witnesses recanted. Charges dropped. Defendant disappeared October 9, 1984. No further investigation recorded. Disappeared. Right before the fire. Mason reached for his phone and took pictures of everything, the wall of files. The chain-bound chair. The bloodstain. He didn't know what he was looking at yet. But his gut was screaming. This wasn't a room. It was a prison. And someone had been erased. Diesel sniffed the floor again. Circling slowly. Then he stopped at the far corner. His ears flattened. He let out a deep, trembling growl. What is it, boy? Mason stepped closer, shining his light. There, underneath a loose floorboard, was a bundle. Old cloth, stiff with time. Mason knelt and gently pulled it out. Inside was a sealed envelope. Yellowed and brittle. Across the front, in shaking handwriting. To the one who finally listens. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. They told me to drop the case. Said the town couldn't handle another scandal. But I saw the photos. I heard the tapes. Denton was guilty. And they let him walk. Until he didn't. Until someone made him disappear. I didn't ask how. I just helped seal the room. I couldn't live with it. But maybe someone braver can. J.T. Mason stood slowly. Heart pounding. J.T. That name rang a bell. Back in the squad car. He pulled up the old courthouse staff directory. There, buried under layers of poor quality scans, was the name. Joseph Talbert, County Prosecutor, 1979 to 1985. Retired. No record of where he went after that. Mason leaned back in his seat, staring at the envelope. Someone knew. Someone had tried to speak, only to be shut down. And someone else had gone further, built a hidden room and locked a man inside it. But the question wasn't just what happened to Charles Denton. It was, why was the town so desperate to forget him? As the sun rose behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across its cracked brick walls, Diesel sat upright in the backseat, ears forward, tail twitching. He wasn't done yet, and neither was Mason. By noon that day, Mason Briggs had all the files spread across his dining table, photos, transcripts, maps of the courthouse, and the single-page letter from Joseph Talbert. Diesel paced the room, occasionally stopping to stare at the door, ears twitching at the sound of passing cars. His restlessness mirrored Mason's. Mason opened his laptop and typed the name, Charles Denton. Very little came up. An old arrest record, a blurry newspaper article from 1984. Local youth counselor faces charges in abuse case. Then, nothing. No obituary. No missing persons report. Not even a rumor. It was like the man had never existed. He tried Joseph Talbert next, the retired prosecutor who'd written the letter. And there, on a local genealogy blog, was a post titled, "Where are they now?" Former Willow Creek officials. Joseph Talbert, now in his 80s, was living in a nursing home 2 towns over. Still alive. Mason didn't wait. He clipped Diesel's leash, grabbed the envelope, and headed out. The Elmswood Senior Center was quiet, its lobby filled with soft piano music and the scent of linen spray. Mason flashed his badge at the front desk. "I'm looking for Joseph Talbert. Visiting on official business." The nurse hesitated. "Mr. Talbert doesn't speak to many people." "I'm not many people," Mason replied, "and he left something behind that I think he wants found." After a few minutes, Mason was led into a modest room where a frail man sat in a recliner. watching static on an old television. His eyes were glassy but sharp. "Mr. Talbert?" Mason asked gently. "You the one with the dog?" Mason blinked. "How did you?" "I figured someone would come. Eventually." Talbert's voice was brittle, but steady. "Took you long enough." Mason pulled the envelope from his pocket and handed it to him. "I found this behind a wall no one was supposed to know about." Talbert didn't look surprised. "You ever hear the phrase justice delayed is justice denied?" "Sure. Well, Willow Creek didn't delay it. They just skipped it altogether." Mason sat down. "Tell me what happened to Denton." Talbert looked out the window for a long time. Then said, "He was a predator. Worked with kids. A counselor. Unofficially. Church programs. Youth services. He had charm. He had trust. And he used both to ruin lives." "You were going to prosecute him?" "I had 3 victims ready to testify. 2 more willing to sign statements. But the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Brandt, told me to let it go. Said we couldn't afford another scandal after the budget fraud the year before." "You let him go?" "No. I refused to drop it. That night, someone set fire to the courthouse archives. Destroyed half my case. The next day, Denton disappeared. No trial. No search. No press." Mason's throat went dry. "You think they killed him?" Talbert's eyes were cold now. "I think someone made a decision. That it was easier to bury a man than let his trial bury the town." Mason remembered the chains, the chair, the dried blood. "They didn't just kill him," Mason said. "They held him first. Someone built a room in the wall." Talbert's hands trembled. "I suspected, but I didn't want to know. That's why I left the letter. Because silence has weight, and I've carried it too long." Mason stood slowly. "Did you know who did it?" Talbert looked up, his face hollowed by time and guilt. "Start with Sheriff Brandt, then ask who funded the West Wing repairs. That wall was their tombstone." Back at the station, Mason dug into county records from 1984. Most were digital copies of old paperwork. But one name kept surfacing, signed at the bottom of every courthouse restoration permit. Every construction invoice. Every fire insurance claim. C. Brandt. Sheriff Clyde Brandt. The same man who'd served Willow Creek for 22 years. Praised as a pillar of moral leadership. He died in 2002. But his son, Councilman Tom Brandt, was still alive. Still sitting on the town council. Still guarding his father's secrets. Councilman Tom Brandt didn't expect anyone to show up at his woodworking shop that afternoon. Much less a local officer with a police dog and a folder full of 40-year-old paperwork. The shop smelled of pine shavings and varnish. Classical music played softly on a radio by the window. Mason found Tom sanding a maple chair. Sleeves rolled up, sawdust clinging to the creases of his jeans. Tom looked up, surprised. "Officer Briggs, isn't it? Something I can help you with?" Mason didn't answer right away. He placed the folder on the workbench and opened it. Blueprints. Fire reports. Copies of old invoices. Right on top. The permit for the courthouse West Wing repairs. Signed by C. Brandt. Tom's eyes flicked to the name. Then back to Mason. "My father signed that." "So? Your father was sheriff in 1984. Mason said. "The year Charles Denton disappeared. The year a fire, accidentally, destroyed a case against him. And the year someone built a sealed room in the courthouse wall." Tom wiped his hands with a rag. Slow and deliberate. "I think you've been watching too many detective shows." "I found the room," Mason said quietly. "I found what was inside it. And I found a letter written by the man who tried to prosecute Denton. A letter that says your father shut it all down." Tom's jaw clenched. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," Mason added. "I just need to know if your father ever told you the truth." Tom didn't speak for a long moment. Then, softly, "You ever grow up in a town where the name on your birth certificate decides whether people trust you or fear you? I live in one now. My father kept this town afloat. That's how people saw it. Not because he was good, but because he kept things quiet." Mason leaned in. "Did he tell you what happened to Denton?" Tom nodded once. "He didn't say his name. He just said, 'Some men don't deserve the law. They deserve to vanish.' I thought it was just bravado. Something a sheriff says after a bottle of bourbon." Mason studied him. "But you knew." "I suspected," Tom said, voice flat. "But by then he was dying. What was I supposed to do? Dig up a ghost?" "You think ghosts stay buried?" Mason asked. "I have a K9 who disagrees." From the truck outside, Diesel barked once, sharp, clear, and almost perfectly timed. Tom flinched. Mason closed the folder and stood. "I'm not asking you to confess. I'm asking for names. Who else knew?" Tom hesitated, then said 2 words. "The judge." "Judge Wilson?" "No. His father. Judge Elias Wilson. He signed off on everything back then, permits, prosecutions, you name it. He was the kingmaker in this town until the day he died. And if you're smart, Briggs," Tom's voice dropped, "you'll stop digging." That night, someone left a dead squirrel on Mason's front porch. Gutted. Arrange. Diesel saw it first. He didn't bark, just stood there, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the hedge line. Mason stepped outside with his flashlight and scanned the darkness. Nothing. No footprints. No tire tracks. Just the message. "We know you're looking." Inside, Mason clipped Diesel's vest on tight and locked every door. The case wasn't buried anymore. But someone wanted it to stay that way. The next morning, Mason stood in front of a crumbling Victorian home just off Maple Street. It had once belonged to Judge Elias Wilson, now deceased. According to county records, it had passed to his son, Peter Wilson, who still lived there, off the grid and mostly unseen. The paint on the shutters was peeling. The grass hadn't been cut in months. But there was a light on in the attic window. Diesel sat in the passenger seat of the cruiser, staring at the door like he expected it to open on its own. Mason took a breath and knocked. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time. A curtain shifted on the second floor. Then, creaking footsteps. The door opened 3 inches, revealing a man in his early 60s, with gray hair, watery eyes, and a cigarette trembling in his fingers. "Peter Wilson?" Mason asked. "Who wants to know?" "I'm Officer Briggs. I need to ask you about your father. And about something that may still be in this house." Peter's laugh was dry and bitter. "You're about 40 years too late, officer. I think I'm right on time." Peter stared at him a long time, then finally stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like mothballs, tobacco, and old books. Dust floated through the sunlight like snow in slow motion. Dozens of law volumes lined the walls, untouched for decades. "My father didn't leave much behind," Peter muttered. "But what he did leave, I boxed up in the attic. I haven't gone through it. Didn't see the point." "I do." They climbed the narrow stairs. Each creak felt like a warning. The attic was stifling. A single bulb dangled from a chain, swinging gently. Peter gestured toward a corner stacked with crates and old leather-bound ledgers. "Knock yourself out." Mason dug through the first box, court documents from the early 80s. Routine sentencing logs, financial forms. Then, in the third crate, he found it. A black leather ledger, unmarked except for a gold clasp. When he opened it, his pulse skipped. Inside were handwritten notes, not legal rulings. Deals. Transfer suspect to Facility B, no formal record. Approved, archive sealed. Wilson, Jenkins, Brand present. Denton, containment chosen. Community benefit outweighs cost. Mason's hands trembled. These weren't the words of a judge. They were the words of a fixer. A man who didn't deliver justice, he managed it. At the back of the book was a list of initials, all under the heading, Contributors, Project Silent Room. Mason froze. S.B., Sheriff Brandt. E.W., Elias Wilson. H.C., Harold Crane. C.D., confirmed deceased. J.T., Joseph Talbert. T.B., Councilman Tom Brandt? Before Mason could turn the page, Diesel, waiting at the attic door, let out a sharp, alarmed bark. Mason's head snapped up. Downstairs, the front door had opened, then slammed. Peter looked at Mason, face pale. "Did you lock the door?" "No." Then they heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Not just someone snooping. Someone coming for them. Mason tucked the ledger under his jacket and whispered, "Stay behind me." Diesel growled low. His stance stiffened. Eyes locked on the stairwell. Then, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. The shadow on the stairwell moved again, closer. Slow. Deliberate. Mason held his breath. One hand hovered over his holster, the other gripping the black ledger inside his jacket like it might disappear if he let go. Diesel stood rigid, head lowered, lips curled back in a low, guttural growl that made Peter Wilson step behind a stack of crates without hesitation. Then, Briggs. The voice was familiar. Low, grating. Tom Brandt, councilman, son of the late sheriff. And, apparently, the last name on the list. I figured I'd find you digging around somewhere. Tom called up the stairs. You were warned. Mason took 2 steps forward and raised his voice. What do you want, Brandt? Not much. Tom replied calmly. Just what's mine, that ledger. And your silence. Diesel barked once, sharp and piercing. The tension in the attic snapped like a wire. Tom was on the stairs now. Gun drawn. Last chance. Officer. Hand it over. Mason didn't flinch. You were there, weren't you? When they locked Denton up. You helped seal the room. Probably even bricked the wall yourself. Tom sneered. I did what my father couldn't finish. Denton was a monster. And monsters don't get trials, they get buried. And who gave you the right to decide that? Tom raised his weapon. Same people who always had it. The ones keeping this town safe from its own demons. At that moment, Diesel lunged. With a snarl that echoed off the attic walls. The K9 leapt from behind Mason, his jaws clamping down on Tom's forearm just as the man fired. The bullet missed, slamming into the ceiling with a puff of insulation. Tom crashed back onto the stairs, screaming, the gun clattering from his hand. Mason vaulted down the steps in 2 strides and kicked the weapon away. Then wrestled Tom to the floor as Diesel held his grip. By the time backup arrived, summoned by Peter's trembling 911 call, Tom Brandt was cuffed. Bruised and silent, Diesel sat beside him, panting but alert, eyes never leaving the man's face. The fallout was swift, explosive, and unstoppable. Mason turned over the ledger, the photos, and the contents of the sealed room to the State Bureau and the District Attorney's office. The story broke within 48 hours. Headlines exploded across the region. Ghost prison inside courthouse. Police dog uncovers decades-old cover-up. Willow Creek power players linked to illegal detainment. Vigilante justice. Harold Crane, the courthouse archivist, resigned within a day. Peter Wilson gave sworn testimony. The former fire marshal, long retired, was named in an ethics review. And Tom Brandt? He was charged with obstruction of justice, unlawful entry, and attempted assault on an officer. But that was only the beginning. A full criminal investigation opened into the 1984 courthouse fire, and what it had really been meant to destroy. A month later, the sealed chamber inside the west wall was dismantled brick by brick. The town held its breath as forensic teams catalogued what remained. They didn't find Charles Denton's body. But they found something else. Scratches on the walls. Deep, desperate, dated. A name etched again and again with what must have been a broken nail or piece of chain. Charlie D. Charlie D. Charlie D. And then, one final message. Barely legible. I wasn't innocent, but you weren't either. Back at the station, Mason sat on the steps of the precinct as Diesel rested his head on his boot. You knew, Mason whispered, before any of us. You never left that wall alone. Diesel didn't move, but his tail thumped once against the concrete. Just once. 3 weeks after the courthouse room was exposed. The West Wing was demolished. Bulldozers pushed down walls that had stood for over a century. The bricks fell silently, like they, too, had waited years for release. The town of Willow Creek didn't hold a press conference. There were no speeches, no ribbon cuttings, just a quiet, cold afternoon and a few curious locals watching history collapse into dust. Mason stood at the edge of the site with Diesel beside him. The K9's black fur streaked with gray dust. A worker handed Mason something recovered from the debris, a rusted ID badge. Scorched at the edges, the name barely legible, Charles Denton, for all intents and purposes. That badge was the only grave he'd ever have. Back at the precinct, things had shifted. Mason was no longer the officer people ignored at council meetings. He was now the one who didn't let go. There was talk of promotion. Talk of a commendation for Diesel. Even whispers from the State Bureau. You ever consider cold cases full-time? But Mason wasn't sure. He sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the evidence board that was now mostly cleared. Only one photo remained. Diesel in front of the sealed courthouse wall. Leash slack. Eyes locked on the bricks. That was the moment the story began. Not with a scream. Not with a witness. With a dog. And a bark no one wanted to hear. The next morning, Angela Denton came to see him. Charles Denton's niece. She was a teacher in Ohio. She had never known her uncle well, just remembered family reunions where his presence made the air tense. "I don't want to defend him," she told Mason. "I just want to understand." Mason handed her a copy of the letter Joseph Talbert had written, the one buried with the truth. Angela read it slowly, lips trembling. "He did terrible things," she said, "but hiding him, like that? It made us all part of it." Mason nodded. "Sometimes justice looks clean. Other times, it's a sealed wall and 4 decades of silence." Angela left with tears in her eyes, and the badge. By late fall, the town council approved Mason's request. The courthouse site would become a memorial garden. Not for Denton, but for the truth, and for everyone who had once been told to look away. A stone plaque was installed at the center. Here stood the wall they tried to forget. But a dog remembered, and the silence ended. On the day it was unveiled, a group of schoolchildren brought handmade signs. One read, "Thank you, Diesel, you saw what we couldn't." That evening, Mason sat on his porch with Diesel curled at his feet, the air cold enough for breath to show. He held a letter in his hand, an invitation from the State Cold Case Task Force. They wanted him and Diesel to join a new division: rural investigations, unsolved disappearances, files that had gathered too much dust. Mason folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. "You up for one more round, old man?" he asked. Diesel raised his head, alert as ever. His ears twitched. Then, just once, he barked. Not loud, just enough. Epilogue. 6 months later, Officer Briggs and Diesel cracked a 17-year-old missing persons case 2 counties north. The body had been buried beneath a church garden. The scent was faint, the bones old, but Diesel found her, a girl no one had searched for in years. And once again, the headlines ran, "K9 Hero Uncovers Buried Truth," again. And somewhere, in Willow Creek, where a plaque sits in a quiet garden, a child walks by and reads the final line aloud. Sometimes, the loudest voice in the room doesn't speak at all. 3 weeks after the courthouse room was exposed, the West Wing was demolished. Bulldozers pushed down walls that had stood for over a century. The bricks fell silently, like they, too, had waited years for release. The town of Willow Creek didn't hold a press conference. There were no speeches, no ribbon cuttings, just a quiet, cold afternoon and a few curious locals watching history collapse into dust. Mason stood at the edge of the site with Diesel beside him. The K9's black fur streaked with gray dust. A worker handed Mason something recovered from the debris, a rusted ID badge. Scorched at the edges, the name barely legible, Charles Denton, for all intents and purposes. That badge was the only grave he'd ever have. Back at the precinct, things had shifted. Mason was no longer the officer people ignored at council meetings. He was now the one who didn't let go. There was talk of promotion, talk of a commendation for Diesel, even whispers from the State Bureau. "You ever consider cold cases full-time?" But Mason wasn't sure. He sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the evidence board that was now mostly cleared. Only one photo remained. Diesel in front of the sealed courthouse wall. Leash slack, eyes locked on the bricks. That was the moment the story began. Not with a scream, not with a witness, with a dog. And a bark no one wanted to hear. The next morning, Angela Denton came to see him. Charles Denton's niece. She was a teacher in Ohio. She had never known her uncle well, just remembered family reunions where his presence made the air tense. "I don't want to defend him," she told Mason. "I just want to understand." Mason handed her a copy of the letter Joseph Talbert had written, the one buried with the truth. Angela read it slowly, lips trembling. "He did terrible things," she said, "but hiding him, like that? It made us all part of it." Mason nodded. "Sometimes justice looks clean. Other times, it's a sealed wall and 4 decades of silence." Angela left with tears in her eyes, and the badge. By late fall, the town council approved Mason's request. The courthouse site would become a memorial garden. Not for Denton, but for the truth, and for everyone who had once been told to look away. A stone plaque was installed at the center. Here stood the wall they tried to forget. But a dog remembered, and the silence ended. On the day it was unveiled, a group of schoolchildren brought handmade signs. One read, "Thank you, Diesel, you saw what we couldn't." That evening, Mason sat on his porch with Diesel curled at his feet, the air cold enough for breath to show. He held a letter in his hand, an invitation from the State Cold Case Task Force. They wanted him and Diesel to join a new division: rural investigations, unsolved disappearances, files that had gathered too much dust. Mason folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. "You up for one more round, old man?" he asked. Diesel raised his head, alert as ever. His ears twitched. Then, just once, he barked. Not loud, just enough. Epilogue. 6 months later, Officer Briggs and Diesel cracked a 17-year-old missing persons case 2 counties north. The body had been buried beneath a church garden. The scent was faint, the bones old, but Diesel found her, a girl no one had searched for in years. And once again, the headlines ran, "K9 Hero Uncovers Buried Truth," again. And somewhere, in Willow Creek, where a plaque sits in a quiet garden, a child walks by and reads the final line aloud. Sometimes, the loudest voice in the room doesn't speak at all.